Good morning. My name is John Worley. I'm here today to talk about Beaufort during the Civil War. As you can see, I'm calling these the coronavirus lectures because while I'm in a classroom at University of South Carolina, Beaufort, there are no students. So you will be my students, and together we will find out about what happened in this town between the years 1861 and 1865, the duration of the Civil War. When you talk about history, especially a history that's well over 100 years old now, you always face the question of where to begin. You could go back to the formation of the earth. That seems a little harsh. Nobody wants to go through all of that. But in this case, so much of Beaufort's Civil War history is dictated by what happened leading up to it. So we're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about that. The best accounts we have of what Beaufort was like at the onset of the war come from the Union soldiers who came here. And as probably most of the people viewing this lecture know, Beaufort was occupied by Union Army and Navy forces for pretty much the duration of the Civil War. And some of the best accounts we have of what the city was like come from those soldiers. Here's a letter from a Union soldier that describes, "The city of Beaufort is, I suppose, one of the handsomest places in the United States. It was inhabited only by the rich, retired planters of the South, and they spared no pains nor expense in making it beautiful with art, and nature could not develop itself more handsomely than it does here. The weather is pleasant the year round. The large shade trees cannot be surpassed for their beauty. Their flower gardens are superb, and there is not a single house but what is clustered around with orange, lemon, and fig trees. Grapes they have in abundance, and in fact everything that the most fastidious could desire to make them happy and contented." Sounds like a pretty nice place, doesn't it? And it was, certainly for the white population. For the black population, it was a different story, but we're going to talk about both populations as we get into this history. Here's another take, this one from a South Carolinian and a historian of note, Edward McCrady. "Beaufort, the wealthiest, most aristocratic, cultivated town of its size in America, a town which, though small in number of inhabitants, produced statesmen, scholars, sailors, and divines whose name and fame are known throughout the country." Here's a third take by Captain Rufus Saxton, who was a major force here during the Union occupation. "We are now in possession of the finest harbor in the South, where the largest ships can enter and ride at anchor in safety. In the heart of the richest part of the cotton district, with direct and easy communication by inland water with Charleston and Savannah, it possesses unrivaled advantages for a quartermaster's and naval depot. And in the future, a great commercial city must grow up here." Well, that was not exactly prophetic on the part of Captain Saxton, and we'll explore some of the reasons for that in the next section I'll be teaching, which is on Reconstruction in Beaufort, but that's for another day. As I said, the question when you examine history is always where to begin. So let's begin with the founding of South Carolina in about 1670 and look at the economy. The first economies were agriculture and trade with the Indians. And agriculture, of course, continues through today. Then in the 1730s, rice became a economic force that lasted through the Civil War. Indigo became a major cash crop in the low country of South Carolina, particularly in the Beaufort area. Rice, not as much. The rice plantations grew up along the Savannah River, up the Combahee River, and Beaufort itself was never a major rice-producing community. But indigo, yes, and that boom, the indigo boom, lasted through the American Revolution. And it was replaced by King Cotton, which made its debut around 1790 and certainly lasted through the Civil War and even beyond into the 20th century. And of course, the common denominator for all of those economic elements was the need for labor. And the need for labor, of course, gets us right into the issue of slavery, because the overwhelming majority of that labor was furnished by enslaved African Americans. The first ones of whom came to the colonies in Virginia in 1619. So Jamestown was founded in 1607. So some 12 years later, some English privateers had seized some Africans from a captured Portuguese ship and brought them to Jamestown. Then between 1720 and 1740, we learned that this was the longest period of unrestricted slave importation in South Carolina history. Some 40,000 slaves brought in to South Carolina, giving you some idea of the demand for labor because of the agriculture being produced here. And this, of course, as we approach the American Revolution and the Constitution, highlights the Southern dilemma, what I'm calling the Southern dilemma. Because the Constitution, as we'll see in a moment, authorized legislative representation based on population, the South wanted African Americans to be included in that count as people. But for all other purposes, they wanted them considered property. And Madison highlighted this in Federalist 54. Madison said, "We subscribe to the doctrine," might one of our Southern brethren observe, "that representation relates more immediately to persons and taxation more immediately to property. And we join in the application of this distinction to the case of our slaves. But we must deny the fact that slaves are considered merely as property and in no respect whatsoever as persons. The true state of the case is, according to Madison, that they partake of both these qualities, being considered by our laws in some respects as persons and in other respects as property." And of course, this distinction is going to pervade the 19th century and ultimately be resolved by the Civil War and its outcome. So here's the text from the Constitution, Article 1. "Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers. And African Americans were to be considered 3/5 of a person." So, as Madison said, on the one hand, property characteristics, on the other hand, personal characteristics. And this is the way the founders of the country and the Constitution resolved the demand by the Southern states for greater representation in the newly formed Congress. So let's talk about the specific events leading up to the Civil War that caused the South very early in the formation of the Union to have its doubts as to whether or not it could remain in the Union. Slavery was, of course, a primary cause of the Civil War, but it wasn't the only cause. South Carolinians started talking about secession as early as 1828 with what they call the Tariff of Abominations. And why were tariffs such a contentious issue? To illustrate that point, let's talk about a hammer. And this is a hypothetical example on my part, and the numbers that I'm going to give you are all hypothetical, but I think it illustrates what the Tariff of Abominations was all about from a Southern perspective. Essentially, the South viewed these tariffs as an effort by the North to use their influence in the Congress to enrich the manufacturers in the North and to disadvantage the South. How did they do that? Well, let's talk about that hammer. Let's say that the cost of a British hammer imported into the United States prior to 1828 was $10. A foreign country sending cheap imports into the United States. Maybe that rings a bell in today's climate as well. But back then it was the British. They could manufacture things more cheaply than they could in New England. So let's say the cost of that same hammer manufactured in New England was $12 at the time. Well, if you're a Southern planter and you need a hammer, you're likely to buy the British hammer, the cheaper one, prior to 1828, which costs the New England manufacturers business. So to correct that, Congress passed the Tariff of 1828, which increased the cost of imported goods by 38%. And raw materials by 45%. But we're not going to talk about raw materials. We're just going to focus on this hammer. So now the cost of a British hammer after the tariffs is $13.80. Obviously more expensive than the New England hammer at $12, and that was the whole point of the tariff. However, the New England manufacturers weren't stupid, and they said, okay, now a British hammer costs $13.80. We can hike our price up to $13 and make more money than we could at $12 and still undercut the British price. So now Southerners have a choice between a $13 hammer purchased from New England and a $13.80 hammer purchased from England. And in either case, the cost to them of a hammer that was once as cheap as $10 has gone up. So you multiply that across all of the goods being imported from England and New England, and you have a tremendous impact on the Southern economy. And you have a lot of resentment in the South over this. As I say, they viewed it less as a revenue matter and more as an effort by the Congress to protect Northern manufacturers. And let's remember, the South, fatally, in the view of most, failed to nurture its manufacturing facilities at all. What outspoken critics of manufacturing, like some of our elected representatives, specifically John C. Calhoun, who was a powerful force in South Carolina at the time, discouraged manufacturing. And of course, that would eventually come back to bite the South. So that's why the tariff was so controversial in the South. They hated it. So in 1828, Andrew Jackson defeated John Quincy Adams as the president, and the tariff was a big issue in that election. The South, because Jackson was elected and Jackson was a Southerner, expected relief from the tariffs, but they didn't get the relief they needed. Another tariff came along as a compromise in 1832, but that didn't satisfy South Carolina either. Now, Jackson's vice president was a South Carolinian, John C. Calhoun, and he articulated the concept of nullification, which was essentially that the federal law would be ignored on the collection of these tariffs. And that got Jackson's ire up, and the Congress responded to this defiance by the southern states, or this threatened defiance, by passing what was called the Force Bill. And that authorized Jackson to use military force to force South Carolina to comply. Another compromise was reached in 1833 that kind of diffused the crisis, but many in South Carolina, and particularly in Beaufort, noted that this force bill might one day be used not to nullify or enforce the tariffs, but to outlaw slavery, and that the South viewed as fatal to its economy. The South simply, in its view, could not survive without slavery. And the chief spokesman for this view became a man born and raised in Beaufort, known as Robert Barnwell Rhett, who has come down to us through history as the father of secession. We're going to talk more about Rhett throughout this lecture because he was a force to be reckoned with. He was born in 1800 and curiously was born as Robert Barnwell Smith. There were 6 or 7 of the Smith brothers, and they all collectively decided to change their name to Rhett. They thought Smith sounded much more common than they wanted to be considered, a common surname, and they wanted something that they thought sounded more distinguished, and they had a relative named Rhett, and so they adopted as a group this new name, Robert Barnwell Rhett. Rhett was a fierce opponent of the Tariff of Abominations, declaring, quote, "A people owning slaves are mad or worse than mad who do not hold their destinies in their own hands." And he was referring, of course, to the Force Bill and the ability of the federal government to order the slaves freed. Rhett went on to be elected Attorney General of South Carolina in 1832. He was elected to Congress in 1837. And in 1844, he founded a movement called the Bluffton Movement, which was a collection of the planters that were already calling for secession. Now, this is, many years before the Civil War broke out, but there was already a demand for secession. But it must be said that the demand was mostly from South Carolina. The rest of the southern states were not as quite as aggressive in this as South Carolina was. And if you've been around Beaufort at all, you know the Secession House. This house was owned by Edmund Rhett, who was a brother of Barnwell Rhett, Robert Barnwell Rhett. And this house is believed to be the site of many discussions in the 1850s leading up to the Civil War. And it's considered the place where the conspiracy to take South Carolina out of the Union was actively pursued. So how did South Carolina, which of course was the first state to secede from the Union, how did South Carolina justify secession? Well, they had some interesting theories. For one, they felt like the Bible and Scripture sanctioned slavery. So they were doing right in the eyes of God by owning slaves. They thought they had support for that position under the Constitution, where a state had the right to exercise any controls that were not specifically delegated to the federal government. That's the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. The Southern economy, unlike the North, was wholly dependent on slave labor. They simply could not grow what they grew without slave labor in the view of the South. The Supreme Court added to the South's sense of righteousness when it decided the Dred Scott decision in 1858, a decision that was greeted with scorn everywhere but in the South, which celebrated Chief Justice Taney's infamous decision in the Dred Scott case. There was a collection assumption that abolition would mean societal changes that were simply unacceptable to white Southerners. And the most influential leaders of the state were all in support of secession. The one exception to that was a lawyer in Charleston named James Pettigrew, who famously claimed that South Carolina, his famous quote is, "South Carolina, too small to be a country, too large to be an insane asylum." Pettigrew was a Unionist and died before the end of the Civil War, but he was a lone voice in the wilderness in South Carolina. What kind of leaders are we talking about? I suspect that the Union Army and Navy personnel who arrived here in 1861 expected that they were coming to this backwater area, this boondocks of remote South Carolina, where they would find people who couldn't read, who were missing all their teeth, who were having relations with their cousins. I suspect that this was sort of the common feeling, the prototype Southerner from a Northerner's viewpoint. But they would have been very much mistaken. We know that from a lot of the Union correspondence back home during the war. But let's take a look at some of the people who influenced South Carolina's decision to secede, because that secession, of course, is what led to Beaufort's unique history during the Civil War. I mentioned Dred Scott, the decision that that American citizenship did not include black people. We would react with that today with horror and amazement, and many people in the North at the time reacted that way. But the Supreme Court decided that the privileges afforded by the Constitution were simply not available to black Americans. Now, we're looking at some of the influential Southerners. Here's Richard Fuller, who was a minister. Born in Beaufort, finished at the top of his class at Harvard, had to leave because of an illness. But he had such an excellent academic record at Harvard that it awarded him an honorary degree, even though he failed to graduate. And as you will note, as I go through a few of these biographies, back in these times, Southerners sent their sons to the best schools in America, which were concentrated in New England. So we've got Harvard and Yale graduates. That was the routine. After the Civil War, not so much. But before the Civil War, that's where Southerners who could afford it and who were focused on education sent their sons. So the first of these we'll deal with is Richard Fuller. He had a born-again experience in 1831. There was a revival movement that swept through the Low Country around that time, and he was caught up in it. and he was ordained as a Baptist minister. And here's a man who dedicated his ministry to African Americans. He spearheaded the erection of the Beaufort Baptist Church, which stands today a few blocks from where I'm giving this talk, the Beaufort Baptist Church, which had an integrated congregation and baptized both blacks and whites in the Beaufort River at the foot of Charles Street. If you can imagine that scene today, it would draw quite a crowd. He was the intellectual leader of the Baptist movement in the South. He authored a piece called Domestic Slavery Considered as a Scriptural Institution, which posited that slavery was sanctioned by Jesus and the Gospels, providing low-country plantation owners a moral justification for their peculiar institutions. I mentioned that a few minutes ago that the South viewed slavery as sanctioned by the Bible and Scriptures, and Fuller was one of the major proponents of that view. In 1851, he gave a speech before the American Colonization Society, and President Fillmore was in the audience. He was urging compromise on the slavery issue, pointing to the half-finished Washington Monument and telling his audience that unless compromise was reached, the monument would stand as an unfinished epitaph to the nation. Here is Fuller, a full 10 years before the Civil War broke out, forecasting the demise of the Union unless compromise was reached. And as we all know, compromise was not reached. Next, we have William J. Grayson. Born in Beaufort, attended the University of South Carolina when it was known as South Carolina College. He was a friend of James Pettigrew, who I mentioned a minute ago as the Unionist lawyer in Charleston. He became Pettigrew's biographer. In 1828, he co-founded the Beaufort Gazette, Beaufort's first newspaper. And he was a prolific writer, but is best remembered for a poem called The Hireling and the Slave. That poem sought to put slavery on an equal footing with wage earners in the North and Europe. In other words, he was arguing through this poem that slaves didn't actually have it worse than wage earners, and actually had it a little better on many fronts. And the whole poem was designed to be a rebuttal to Uncle Tom's Cabin, which at that point was wildly popular, at least in the North. Next, we have Stephen Elliot. Again, born in Beaufort, graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Yale in 1791. Served on the first board of trustees of Beaufort College, organized the Beaufort Library Society, served in both the South Carolina House and Senate, is remembered as the author of Botany of South Carolina and Georgia in 2 volumes, a principal organizer of the Medical College of South Carolina. Think about that. In 1824, we still have MUSC today, and he was one of the original organizers. First professor of natural history and botany at MUSC, honorary degrees from Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and MUSC. President of the legendary Charleston Library Society, and co-founder of the Southern Review, a man of great ability. And here's his home as pictured during the Civil War. I think you can see he wasn't alive at the time. This picture was taken. I think you can see, as in many of these pictures I'm going to show you, Union soldiers standing outside the residence, because it was obviously used for other purposes during the occupation. William Elliot III, again, born in Beaufort, Three generations of Elliots lived at the Anchorage 1770, which many of you listening to my voice will know well as a very popular bed and breakfast and restaurant here in Beaufort. His father was the first to plant Sea Island cotton in Beaufort, and Sea Island cotton, of course, became the gold standard for cotton. Phi Beta Kappa at Harvard, president of Beaufort Agricultural Society, and a South Carolina representative to the Paris exposition, in 1855. He grew Elliot cream cotton. That's a nice name, right? The gold standard for Sea Island cotton. And Sea Island cotton at the time was a long staple cotton. It was grown for whatever reasons only in the low country of South Carolina, and most of the cotton ended up in England, and it was the major cash crop, and it brought the highest prices for cotton anywhere in the world. He was mayor of Beaufort in 1825, hosted Lafayette on his farewell tour of America, and is remembered today as the author of a book entitled Carolina Sports by Land and Water. This was a famous book. Everybody in Beaufort at the time had a copy of this book. But today, if you want a copy, I saw it on Abe Books for $3,000. This is obviously an original, but the book is still around. It's quite I've read it a couple of times, and it's quite a expose on life in the low country by land and water, hunting and fishing, in other words. This brings us to Robert Woodward Barnwell. Born in Beaufort, a direct descendant of Tuscarora Jack Barnwell, who is generally credited with founding Beaufort. And Robert Woodward Barnwell, one of his great nephews, became known as the Oracle of Beaufort. He was Phi Beta Kappa and valedictorian of his class at Harvard, a famous class of 1821, where his best friend was Ralph Waldo Emerson. The Civil War reduced Barnwell to poverty, as it did most Southerners of means. And when it did, Barnwell sought to sell his library. Emerson sent him $700 asking him not to sell his library, and he included this note, which I think is a moving tribute. I wish you to know that distance, politics, war even, and I'll say parenthetically, obviously Emerson was on the other side of the slavery question. I wish you to know that distance, politics, war even, at least have not been able to efface in any manner the high, affectionate, exceptional regard in which I, in common, I believe, with all your contemporaries of 1817 to 1821, have firmly held you as our avowed chief in days when boys, as we were then, give a tender and romantic value to that distinction which they cannot later give again. Quite a tribute coming from a man like Ralph Waldo Emerson. Here we see Robert Woodward Barnwell's home in Beaufort, a home he called Woodward. He served in the Congress, and as president of the University of South Carolina, he was instrumental in building the South Caroliniana Library, which was probably his greatest accomplishment to the university, which, when he was there, housed over 18,000 volumes, which put it on a level with the best libraries really in America at the time. He was appointed to fill John C. Calhoun's unexpired term in the U.S. Senate when Calhoun died while serving in the Senate. He led the South Carolina delegation to the Montgomery Convention in 1861, was elected its first president, signed the Confederate Constitution, was considered the major influence in electing Jefferson Davis as president of the Confederacy. Davis offered him the position of Secretary of State in the Confederate government, which he declined. He served in the Confederate Senate and became a frequent dinner partner of the famous Civil War diarist Mary Boykin Chestnut, who said that Carolinians revere his goodness above all things. He lived to be 81 years old and had quite an influence. Unfortunately for him and for many of his relatives, of whom I am one, he was on the wrong side of history on this. Most of us living in Beaufort know that one day in our history defined us beyond all other days, at least to the present. And that day was November the 7th of 1861, when the Battle of Port Royal Sound was fought. A brief flashback to the immediate history of the Civil War. Fort Sumter, April of 1861. The war begins. Everyone knew that the South was going to use its major crop, cotton, to raise cash to fund the Confederate Treasury. The Lincoln administration knew that also. But for that to happen, the cotton crop of 1861 had to get to its ultimate destination, London. And London would, of course, pay for the cotton, but who would it pay? Cotton is harvested in the late fall. And so one of the priorities of the Lincoln administration during the summer of 1861 and into the fall of 1861 was to devise a blockade of the southern coast, figuring that if they blockaded the coast, the South would be unable to get the cotton out of the South. But the question was, where would the blockade be headquartered? And there was a lot of speculation about sites along the coast. Wilmington, North Carolina was considered. Some thought Charleston, although that was not considered long because the South, the Confederacy, was firmly in the grip of had a confirmed grip on Charleston at the time. Some thought Savannah would be a good location, others as far as Jacksonville and St. Augustine, Florida. But when 200 Union ships came down the East Coast in late October, early November of 1861, they anchored off Hilton Head Island. The Lincoln administration had made the decision that because of its ideal port, Beaufort would be the headquarters of the blockade. Those 200 ships anchored off the coast, and of course, not all of those were warships. Many of them were coal tenders because this period of 1861 was in the transition from sail to steam. So most of the ships had both capabilities, many of them did. But the Union warships, the most lethal of the ships in the Armada, had steam. Most of them had steam. So they gathered off the coast. There was a storm that separated the Armada coming down the coast, but they regrouped and they mapped out the battle, which commenced on the morning of November the 7th of 1861. Some Union warships were invading Beaufort. Now, what were Beaufort's defenses? They had two forts, one on Hilton Head called Fort Walker. You can see the remains of that fort still today. And the other was on Bay Point, which is across Port Royal Sound. And Bay Point is, that was Fort Beauregard. These two forts guarded the entrance to Port Royal Sound and were, in effect, the only thing standing between the Union and the town of Beaufort. So on the morning of November 7th, which we know from accounts of the battle, dawned clear and bright and windless. It was apparently extremely calm. The battle commenced. It took the Union about 3 hours, maybe 4. This gives you an idea of what the battle configuration looked like. And as I have done for much of this lecture, I have relied heavily on one of the best resources that Beaufort County has and has ever had, the 3-volume History of Beaufort County, written by my friend Larry Rowland, his associates Alex Moore and George Rogers in Volume 1, and Steve Wise, the historian at Parris Island Museum, in Volumes 2 and 3. These are terrific histories, and they contain almost everything you would want to know about this location. And here you can see on this slide the rough idea of the battle. Out off the coast, you see all those ships anchored out there, some of them troop ships, some of them coal tenders. They brought the whole enchilada when they came. The idea of the battle was to send the warships, and you can see those listed, the 17 warships there. The idea was to send them in an elliptical pattern out in the middle of the sound so that they would be the furthest point from the Confederate guns in Fort Walker and Fort Beauregard, but allow the ships to inflict fire on the forts as they passed. In about 3 or 4 hours, the firing from the Confederate forts stopped. The Union sent a delegation ashore. They raised the stars and stripes over the forts, and now Beaufort lay defenseless. They had a telegraph at Fort Walker, and they telegraphed into town the results of the battle, at which point all the citizens of Beaufort fled in what history calls the Great Skedaddle. There were about 1,100 white residents of Beaufort at the time, and the reports were that when Union officers came into Beaufort a day or two after the battle, they only found one white male, and he was drunk on Bay Street. That's a legend, but the legend persists today. I think that actually 2 white merchants stayed behind, one of whom left shortly after the battle, but the other stayed a while. Anyway, Beaufort now lay in Union hands, as it would remain for the duration of the Civil War. So let's focus on some of the important changes to Beaufort that were a result of the Civil War. First of all, the estimate at the time of enslaved African Americans in Beaufort and on the plantations on the Sea Islands was 8,000 to 10,000. Nobody knows the exact total, but some 8,000 to 10,000 people. As a practical matter, not legally, but as a practical matter, those African Americans were all freed with that battle on November 7th. Let's think about that just focus on that for a moment. On Land's End, there was a home owned by a Dr. Jenkins, and from the piazzas of Land's End, you could see Port Royal Sound. And a lot of the planters gathered on the porches on the morning of the battle to see the outcome. And the men, and they would have mostly been men, were largely wealthy, landed, aristocratic in their view, well-educated, sophisticated. They went to Europe. They sent their children to the best schools. They were the cream of the Southern society of the time. And when they went to bed on the night, that's the way they woke up on the morning of November 7th. When they went to bed that night, they were broke, they were landless, they were incomeless, they were basically had little, if anything, left unless they had invested outside of South Carolina. On the other hand, on the morning of November 7th, some 8,000 to 10,000 African Americans woke up enslaved, as they had been for generations. But by the time the sun set, their masters had fled, so they were, as a practical matter, free. This was a dramatic change of events and influences Beaufort to this day. Union occupation of Beaufort lasted the entire war, and because it did, Beaufort was spared the destruction suffered by many southern towns, Columbia being one of the principal ones that Sherman burned on his way north. Tax sales, which we're going to talk about in a minute, redistributed forever the land in Beaufort County. At the time the Civil War broke out, there were large plantations of hundreds and thousands of acres owned by the planters, the rich planters, and tended by enslaved African Americans. Tax sales redistributed that, broke up those large plantations, and distributed land in some measure to the people who worked the land. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the lecture. The Port Royal experiment was conducted here. The feeling in the North was that Beaufort provided a perfect petri dish, for lack of a better term, for what Reconstruction might look like after the war was over, assuming the Union won, as the Union assumed it would. And in the spring of 1862, after numerous articles started appearing in northern periodicals about the dire plight of the former slaves in Beaufort and the Sea Islands, a combination of abolitionists and missionaries began migrating to Beaufort. The first arrived in, I think, March or April of 1862, and some of them stayed for the duration of the war. They were, by and large, well educated. They came to teach the newly freed slaves, being called freedmen, and they came to distribute much needed clothing, food, and supplies, and many came to further the abolitionist cause. And that collectively became known as the Port Royal experiment, specifically the educational component of the Port Royal experiment. The theory was that if you provided African American students with the same physical locations, the same books, the same teachers, the same educational resources as enjoyed by white students, that African American students could learn and would learn on the same level as white students, which was where the whole idea of an experiment came from. Robert Smalls and other black leaders ushered in an unprecedented period of African American civil engagement. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Robert Smalls in this section, but most of the discussion of the influence of African American leaders will come in my program on Reconstruction, which I'm doing after this segment on Beaufort during the Civil War. Beaufort had a unique Reconstruction history, and it's fascinating, but I'm not going to talk about it today. Economic advantages set the stage for Beaufort's prosperity in Reconstruction. What were those advances? Well, one was carpetbaggers. A lot of Northerners came down when they saw economic opportunity in Beaufort during the war. They felt safe because the Union soldiers occupied it. And they brought money with them. So that was an infusion into the Beaufort economy. Many of the soldiers who, when they finished their service, either stayed in Beaufort or came back to Beaufort once they left. And all of that contributed to Beaufort's economic prosperity after the war. Let's take a snapshot of Beaufort at the outbreak of the war. And again, this comes from the descriptions in the excellent History of Beaufort County, Volume 1. It had a population of slightly over 1,000 whites, 64 foreign-born people, 29 free people of color. Charleston had many more free people of color than Beaufort. Beaufort only had a few. For retail, there were 2 large stores, lots of small shops, mostly serving the needs of plantations out on the Sea Islands. Transportation, the Whitehall Ferry from Beaufort downtown. We're going to see pictures of that now, and as you know from the local news, Whitehall is being developed as a park across the water on Ladies Island. There was a steamship service from Charleston to northern Florida along what is now the Intracoastal Waterway. And there was also the recently completed Charleston and Savannah Railroad. You could catch the railroad at Yemassee, and the trip from Charleston to Savannah took, I can't remember if it was 8 hours or 12 hours, but it was a whole lot shorter than it would have taken you to go from Charleston to Savannah by any other method of transportation. And the railroad had just been finished when the war broke out, and that became a big part of the Union Army's effort during the occupation, was to get that railroad. They never really did until the end of the war, but they tried a bunch. So the industrial resources were steam-powered grist mill and numerous cotton gins. Education, they had Beaufort College, from which I am addressing you today. Although it's now USC Beaufort. Beaufort College was one of 5 educational resources in South Carolina at the time the Civil War broke out. Its graduates, it was more really like a prep school back then rather than a college. So its graduates went on to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Brown, University of Virginia, and South Carolina College, which is now USC. For white males, a seminary and numerous private schools. For white females, the Beaufort Female Seminary, founded in 1852. For enslaved African Americans, male or female, no schools, and it was against the law at the time to teach them to read. the teaching them to read was thought to allow them greater access to subversive materials coming out of the North, abolitionist materials, and also would aid them in any sort of slave conspiracy or uprising, which was a constant fear by the slave owners back in the day. Educational resources. The Beaufort Library held over 4,000 volumes. The Northern soldiers were amazed at the library they found when they occupied Beaufort. The Beaufort Post Office distributed 33,120 newspapers annually and 3,460 magazines annually. This was a snapshot taken, I believe, in the year 1860. But so you have Beaufortonians subscribing to libraries from all over the country and the world, and magazines also. So a very literate society. Beaufort had a bank, the Beaufort Building and Loan Association, chartered in 1852. I believe that bank was located in what we now know as Panini's, the building. So let's talk about those elements of Beaufort at the outbreak of the war. On the Sea Islands, there were about 150 large plantations. And as I say, the slave population was somewhere around 8,000 to 10,000 African Americans. Here's a street scene from Retreat Plantation, 1860. Sam Cooley was a photographer that took a lot of these pictures, and they're available at the Beaufort County Library Lowcountry Digital Collection. So you can view a lot of what I'm showing you online if you go to that digital collection. Here's a photo of Brigadier General Isaac Ingalls Stevens and his staff on Bay Street shortly after the Battle of Port Royal Sound. The house they're standing in front of or on the piazza of is still there at, I think it's 1401 Bay Street. The house is still there. And this was General Stevens' headquarters he was not in Beaufort very long. He was a West Pointer, was transferred to another command, and was killed a year later in a battle in Virginia. I mentioned tax sales. One of the key issues was, how do you distribute real property fairly? Now, keep in mind, because of the Great Skedaddle, all of the white Southerners have fled, and they are the ones who own the real estate in Beaufort. They're not there to pay the taxes on their property, so the taxes go into default. The law empowered the Union to sell that property for the taxes. And they did so with probably delight, because there were some excellent properties available that could be had for a song. And as we'll see in a moment when I show you some maps of Beaufort, the Union was not content to maintain the names of Southern streets, so they renumbered all and relettered all the streets in Beaufort. They did it in a very creative manner. They started, well, let's go to one of those maps and I'll give you an idea of what I'm talking about. Here's one. Here's probably the best Union map we have of Beaufort, around 1862. And the streets are numbered from 1st Street, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, all the way to what we would call Rebo Road. They were numbered. And starting down on Bay Street, they were lettered. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Pretty clever, huh? Well, it had a practical impact, though, because when it came to tax sales, you as a owner of a southern mansion who fled during the Great Skedaddle, if you by any chance found a limited number of newspapers that advertised these sales in the Beaufort area, you might find your house at the corner of 8th Street and D Street. Well, what does that tell you? Nothing. So you can't identify your property from that description. So the upshot was that the overwhelming majority of Southerners did not and could not pay the taxes on their houses, so they went into foreclosure tax sales. And those sales were by and large controlled by a three-person tax commission, appointed obviously by the union. But the question arose how to fairly distribute that property. When I say fairly, I mean many of the people in Beaufort who understood the plight of the African Americans wanted those freedmen to end up owning the property they had worked on possibly for generations. And so they wanted to distribute the property to African Americans. But how do you do that in an auction environment, which typically goes to the highest bidder? And you have Northerners down here with lots of money getting ready to bid big dollars to acquire that property, and investment groups. How do you make sure that the freedmen end up with the land they've been working on? Well, this was a constant source of friction in the years 1862 to 1865 in Beaufort. One of the more interesting tax sales occurred with this home at 511 Prince Street. You can drive by it and see it today. Many of you probably already have. This house was originally owned by the McKee family, and the McKee family owned a young slave named Robert Smalls. Robert Smalls eventually, and we'll talk about him more in a minute, but he would eventually become famous as the man who in 1862, in May of 1862, in Charleston Harbor, commandeered for himself and his family and a few of his co-conspirators a ship, a Confederate ship called the Planter, and sailed it out past Fort Sumter and the other guardians of Charleston's harbor, sailed it out into the Atlantic and delivered the ship to a Union ship as a prize of war, really. And that made Robert Smalls a hero in the Union. It earned him a personal conference with Abraham Lincoln. It earned him the prize money for the value of the ship and its armaments. And Robert Smalls went on to become a congressman from Beaufort and a very influential politician for the rest of his life. But getting back to the McKee house, the McKees had owned Robert Smalls until he earned his freedom by commandeering the Planter. Right before the war, or immediately thereafter, the McKees sold the house to the DeTravels. The DeTravels did not pay the taxes on the house, and so it went to foreclosure. Robert Smalls bought the house at a tax sale in 1863. He paid $605 for it. Today, I believe it was or still is on the market for $1.4 million, but it cost Robert Smalls back in the day $605. Robert Smalls lived in the house for the rest of his life. The DeTravels, however, as many of the Beaufort families who had left in the Great Skedaddle, when they came back, they found their houses were either occupied by Union personnel, or they had been sold at tax sales, and so they were no longer the owners. That was the situation for the de Trevilles. They challenged the title, Robert Smalls's title, at the tax sale, and the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. It is still, de Treville against Smalls is still the leading U.S. Supreme Court decision on tax sales in Beaufort during the Civil War. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Smalls's favor, and Smalls was able to live in the house for the rest of his life. Here's a photo of Smalls taken by the famous Matthew Brady, and many of you know that there is a bust of Smalls on Craven Street here in Beaufort, and the focus of Smalls's life is becoming greater with the emphasis on Reconstruction, which is coming about on the national level now, and has Beaufort as sort of the ground zero for Reconstruction. But we'll talk about that in my next lecture. We're going to talk about some of the people now and some of the places that made Beaufort what it was during the Civil War and during the occupation. I mentioned missionaries and abolitionists who came down from the north as part of the Port Royal experiment. One of the most prominent of those was a woman named Laura Town, who came from Philadelphia in 1862. She had some medical training, which was in dire need on the Sea Islands among the African American population. She came originally just to distribute some clothing, I think planning to stay for around 3 months. But she ended up staying for the rest of her life, which lasted until 1901. She never left after that, and she founded significantly the Penn School, which was the first school opened in the South for freed African Americans. And today you can go out to the Penn Center and see there's a museum out there, and there are interesting buildings to see. And Laura Town was the founder of that school, along with one of her cohorts named Ellen Murray. I don't have a picture of Murray, but this is Laura Town. And here you see a photo of the Penn School taken many years after it was used for the Civil War. This is an 1890 photo, but it gives you some idea of what the structure would have looked like. Here's a freedmen's school at Retreat Plantation. Not everyone could get to Penn Penn School. The Sea Islands, as we all know, living here are very spread out. Water has to be navigated from island to island, and there was simply no way for a lot of these plantation residents to get to school at Penn School, and so they set up freedmen's schools on the various plantations. Here's one of those at Retreat, and in the background you see in the foreground the students, and the background the missionaries who had come to teach. So this brings us back to the Union map of Beaufort around 1862, so shortly after the Union arrived. We're going to course through this map to orient you to a few of the more significant buildings during this time. This is a close-up of what the Union called A Street, but you'll recognize Pier Saxon down there is where the bridge is now, the Woods Bridge. And the street just to the right of the A is Carteret Street. So here's a shot of that as it looked back in that day. The Reeve Sams house at 601 Bay is right at the very end of Bay Street, when you have to take a 90-degree left turn at the end of Bay Street, the Lewis Reeve Sam's house is that last house. And across that, you can see on Port Republic Street, the George Moss Stoney house, which is still standing. The houses between those two houses, that's the house on the far right, the houses between those two houses are no longer there. And here's a postcard. We don't know the date, but it shows you the houses as they would have appeared later. Again, the Lewis Reeve Sam's house there on the right. And it shows you what would have been the dock to the Whitehall Ferry at some point after the war. Bay and Carteret Streets. I believe this is a photo contemporary with the Civil War, and it's where Jim Grimsley's law office would be today, at the corner of Bay and Carteret Streets. So we're going to move down Bay Street a little bit further west. Again, you see the buildings to the right of the A, but now we have another pier at the end of Charles Street, what they Union call Pier DuPont, and the Sea Island Hotel, the George Parsons Elliot House at Bay and Charles, which was used as Hospital Number 15 during the war. Many of Beaufort's antebellum mansions were used as hospitals during the war, and I've tried to identify those. Here's the Brigadier House, a house we're all familiar with, built in the 18th century and still available for tours today. There is a terrific diorama in the Brigadier House. Someone whose name I cannot remember, I apologize for that, has constructed a scale model of Bay Street during the Civil War, which is absolutely fascinating and extremely well done. I wish I could remember the name of the guy who did it, but he did a terrific job. Anyway, you can see Union soldiers and on the porch. The legend, of course, has it that the Marquis de Lafayette delivered a farewell address to Beaufort from the porch of the Brigadier House on his farewell tour of America in 1825. Here's another contemporary picture of the Brigadier House taken during the Civil War. Again, soldiers out on the prominently displayed in front. Here's Bay Street looking west in 1862. One of the merchants that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, Mayo, his grocery is in the foreground, and in the background down the street we can see the Brigadier House. Again, many of these pictures are available online at the digital collection. This happens to be from the Library of Congress's digital collection. The Beaufort waterfront around 1862 looks a little different from the waterfront park that we enjoy today, but you can see the building in the center is still there. Bay Street, 1862. You can see the wide street and the trees on either side, but it must have been a mess when it rained. The Sea Island Hotel, December 1861. This is such an interesting building. This is the Sea Island Hotel is no longer there, but the Best Western Hotel, which is down by the Wells Fargo Bank, is where the Sea Island Hotel stood. And it was a very popular facility during the Civil War and after. It happens to be where in 1880, President Ulysses S. Grant came to Beaufort. He arrived at the depot on the railroad and was escorted to the Sea Island Hotel, where he made a speech that was 5 sentences long. Grant wasn't much of a talker. He went back to, climbed back on the railroad and left, and he was in Beaufort a total of 1 hour. But that was one famous visitor. Another was William Tecumseh Sherman, who spent one night in Beaufort in 1865 on his way north and stayed in the hotel. We're going to move a little farther up Bay Street now as we wind this up. Here's at the far end, the building on the left, used as Hospital Number 5, is Barnwell Castle. You would know that today as the Santa Elena Museum. And next to that, down the street, we have the John Joyner Smith House, which was used as Hospital Number 9, and the William Elliot III House as Hospital Number 11. That's Anchorage, 1770 today. Here's the Barnwell Castle, built just prior to the Revolution by descendants of Tuscarora Jack Barnwell, used as a courthouse during the Civil War and after the Civil War, and destroyed by fire in 1881. Here's a view of the point, and some of these houses you will be able to recognize. Start over on the far right, you'll recognize Title Home, the Edgar Fripp House, which was Hospital Number 7 for officers back during the Civil War. In front of that house, we have the Paul Hamilton House, which is Hospital Number 1, and the Edward Means House, which is still there, Hospital Number 2, B.B. Sam's house. All of these houses are still in the location you see them on this Union map. And they virtually all have been restored and constitute an important part of Beaufort's history. That brings us to a close. We're gonna look at kind of end up where we began, which is at Beaufort College. On this map, you can't see the college very well, but if you look at the center of the map and see HN10, which is Hospital Number 10, that's the Elizabeth Barnwell Gow House, which is still there, and that's where parts of the 54th Massachusetts recouped after the Battle of Battery Wagner in Charleston. You remember the 54th Massachusetts was a black regiment that became famous was made famous currently by the movie Glory starring Denzel Washington. It's the black regiment that assaulted Battery Wagner and took major casualties. And after that battle, they brought the survivors to Beaufort to rest and recover. And Hospital Number 10, the Elizabeth Barnwell Gow House, which is still there, was one of the hospitals used for the sick from the 54th Massachusetts. Across the street from the Elizabeth Barnwell Gow House is the college, which is where I'm speaking to you from. So we're sort of ending up back where we started this. Here's a picture of the Gow House. It has a very interesting history. Elizabeth Barnwell Gow was a single mother back in the day when single mothers just weren't prevalent. She had one daughter, an only child, Mariana Gow Smith, who became the mother of the infamous Robert Barnwell Rhett and all of his, because remember, Rhett was born a Smith. So Mariana Gow Smith begat 6 or 7 sons, one of whom was originally Robert Barnwell Smith, who became Robert Barnwell Rhett and infamous in Beaufort history. And here is a photo of the college where I'm speaking to you from, not that building, but just beyond it. Here's a photo from 1862 with white freedmen students and teachers arrayed on the lawn on what looks like it might be a sunny day in Beaufort, although it doesn't look like a spring day based on the lack of leaves on the trees. Anyway, that is my presentation today, and I hope you have enjoyed it. And I would suggest to you that in the future, I will be doing a program on Reconstruction in Beaufort, and I invite you all to look for that. And if you've enjoyed this presentation, I think you will certainly enjoy the discussion of Reconstruction. Following the Civil War, Beaufort had a period of unparalleled prosperity that we call Reconstruction. And how that all happened and what ultimately happened to it is, I think, makes for an interesting story, and I'll look forward to telling it to you. Thanks for your attention today, and I'm signing off.